You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 6th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio.
India's election and when victory can feel like defeat, and vice versa. D-Day remembered for probably the last time with any of those who were there, and Finland's unusual method for keeping its beaches free of unruly youths. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Carole Walker and Somnath Batabyal will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from the director Mark Radici about his new series, which has found a new way to remember D-Day. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Carole Walker, political commentator and Times radio presenter, and by Somnath Batabyal, lecturer in media and development and international journalism at SOAS. Hello to you both.
Hello. Good evening, Andrew.
Carole, have you been on your much lesser network massively invested in the current UK general election?
I'm afraid I've been absolutely gripped by every single twist and turn, Andrew.
Weirdo.
Maybe the rest of the voting population here in the UK are not quite as excited by this as I am. But I'm afraid, yes, I'm a political geek. I've been loving every moment. I've been reading every twist and turn of the claims and counterclaims. Earlier this week, I was in Salford near Manchester in the northwest of England for the first head-to-head TV debate between Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer.
See, the advantage I would think of going to that in person it would mean there would be much less chance of you throwing your own television into the garden, which I suspect was something that most people who watched it at home, myself very much included, had to fight back.
Yeah, I was in this wonderful location which is known as the Spin Room, which is something that has existed ever since, I think, the very first US televised debates, which is basically a space in which journalists like me get to mingle with senior ministers and shadow ministers, supporters of the two leaders. Each of them...
Stop me if I'm wrong. Do they all come out and tell the journalists, my guy won and the other guy lost?
Absolutely. My guy did absolutely brilliantly. Didn't you see him with that knockout blow? Look, the current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, according to all the polls, is heading to an absolutely devastating defeat. He clearly felt he had nothing to lose in this debate, so he went for it, throwing out all kinds of accusations. He was pretty aggressive. And that made it, I think, certainly, well... It exceeded expectations of many people who have seen these two guys face one another in Parliament every week, and let's say it's not exactly the sort of thing you'd be queuing up for a ticket for.
Well, indeed not. I mean, Somnath, the Spin Room operative I would take seriously would be the one who came out and went, yeah, that sucked. My guy, my guy couldn't punch a hole in a wet paper bag. And I think representatives of either of them would have been accurate in saying as much. Somnath, there is no seamless pivot that I can think of between the UK election and your novel, which is available in all good stores. Please go ahead and plug the heck out of it. And listeners, I have been reading it. I am presently about 3/4 of the way through, and it is tremendous. And I'm not just saying that because you're sitting there.
Andrew, you're such a kind man. Red River is doing very well.
With a cricket stump.
Yes, loads of cricket stories. It's at the moment, it's only available in the Indian subcontinent. It comes to England and America early January. But the reviews have been mind-blowingly good.
And I know, enragingly good if you are the author of less successful books such as myself.
I don't know if it's successful. I mean, I won't tell you how many have sold. I don't know. But the reaction has been good. I'm happy and waiting to see how it does here in the US after. But thank you for reading. I hope you're enjoying the cricket sections. They've been written with a lot of care.
Very much enjoying those. Would you like to mention the title one more time?
Red River.
Red River by Somnath Batabyal. And there is a seamless link out of that to our first actual story, which is India's election, the biggest ever conducted in the history of democracy. The task of counting about 642 million votes has been completed, and by way of perspective, that's only maybe a 2/3 two-third turnout, and fewer of them than anticipated were cast for the governing Bharatiya Janata Party of long-serving Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Modi will get a third term as Prime Minister, but may not get everything his own way during it, as the BJP have lost their parliamentary majority and will have to govern in cahoots with their partners in the National Democratic Alliance. Somnath, were you as surprised as everybody else, including the opposition, by this?
Yes. One thing which we knew was that the ruling party, the BJP, had captured the media, the election, every institution possible, enforcement directorates, police. So your
basic authoritarian state capture template.
So we didn't think that there could be a way. But as you said, 640 million votes are difficult to capture. So and that's what kind of surprised everyone, including, I think, as we were speaking, the Congress party, the single largest opposition. But what is surprising, of course, is that the runners-up are more jubilant than the winners in this election. So that tells you the magnitude of what has happened. I think the most important thing to understand here is that the mandate which has been given to Modi, he was asking for about 400 seats. They've come down to 240. They have lost about 65 seats. And Congress has gained close to more than 50, which is a huge turnaround from what was predicted. Important marker is that the BJP government's biggest achievement, as they were touting, is the Ram Janmabhoomi, the Ram Temple, which was built in Ayodhya, which is a long disputed site. A mosque was burnt in the early 1990s. Thousands were killed. Despite that, in several of the constituencies in Ayodhya, they have lost. That tells you a story that the Hindutva right-wing brigade push has not worked. Again, it has been about the economy and jobs, and that's the simple message which has come. Now, what the opposition does with it, and of course the coalition partners have started asking for the Home Ministry, the Foreign Affairs Ministry, so there'll be a lot of juggling. The huge mandate, the way the last 5 years have gone, that will be curtailed, and it's for the good.
I mean, if we're being optimistic about this and what it means for authoritarian state capture, Carole, and I realise as I'm hastily assembling this theory that there is not an awful lot in common between the politics of India and Poland, but Poland was a country in which a similar programme of state capture was undertaken by the Peace and Justice Party, and they didn't just get their wings clipped at the last election, they actually got tossed out of office, much to everybody's surprise. Is it possible, do you think, law and justice, not peace and justice, is it possible, do you think, that there does come a point, especially in a country with a jealously guarded democratic heritage, that the voters sort of rebel a bit and go, well, actually, no, OK, enough?
I think that is one aspect of it. I think that Indians who are very proud of their democracy were increasingly concerned about the authoritarian way that Modi was grasping so many aspects of state control. But I think that there also seems to have been this sense in which his aggressive Hindu nationalist approach alienated not just Muslims, many of whom felt that they were actually under threat, but perhaps also a lot of younger Indian voters who don't necessarily want to tie themselves to that kind of religious nationalist identity. And as you've mentioned, and as we've been hearing, that once again you have the politicians who are not really addressing the biggest concerns of the voters, which is their jobs, their cost of living. They want some decent housing, some decent investment in their local communities, and that perhaps Modi, in his pursuit of power and those instruments of the state, was overlooking what the voters had on their minds.
I mean, is it also possible, Somnath, when we look at the success of Congress, which, as we were discussing, surprised nobody more than Congress, that it turns out that even among, perhaps even especially among younger generations of India, that Nehru-Gandhi brand still has some resonance? Because obviously one of Congress's principal figureheads is Rahul Gandhi, and you do have to feel sorry for him in the three pairs of big shoes he has to clump around in. given that his great-grandfather, his grandmother and his father were all at some point Prime Minister of India.
Yeah, he's a fifth-generation politician. Rahul Gandhi has been written off by the social media, by India's traditional media. But in the past year and a half, this what we call this pilgrimage that he took around the country, where he met just millions. And we were getting grassroots reports that people are coming out in thousands to meet him. That kind of gave him a certain amount of stature and confidence, which in the last 3-4 months as he came out, which was very different from the Rahul Gandhi we had known, say, a year and a half to 2 years previously. And for once, his coalition partners, the way he made the deals, they seemed to be really good, especially in Uttar Pradesh. In India, you cannot come to power without winning that one big state, and the BJP failed to win that outright, and they lost about 35 seats there. So that was interesting. The coalition partnership with Samajwadi Party really came out well. Smaller states everywhere rebelled against this national hegemonic narrative which the BJP was trying to seek. In West Bengal, in many of the southern states, regional parties won, strengthening the India alliance, as they call it. So while, again, and I have to keep reminding myself that the BJP alone has won 240 seats, the Congress has won about 90 seats. So that's the difference. We have to remember that. But the fact that chief ministers were being jailed, the Delhi chief minister had been jailed just before the elections. Income tax raids were being held. Rahul Gandhi was dismissed from parliament by a Gujarat court. Gujarat is where Modi had been chief minister. Because of all these assaults, this does look like victory to the Congress because of the huge scale of what they have done.
Just finally on this, Carole, and I can exclusively reveal that this Saturday's edition of The Foreign Desk does take a long look at Modi in the world, Modi and the world indeed, following this election. But if we look at him now the way the rest of the world will see him, does he appear a diminished figure? Does the rest of the world, not just India's own people, now start thinking, well, there will be a post-Modi era, won't there?
Yeah, and I think people will be looking to that. But frankly, I think here in the UK, the Prime Minister will be thinking, my goodness, he'd kill for the sort of result that Narendra Modi has just achieved. But I think that there will be perhaps, I mean, we've already had messages of congratulations going to Modi from Rishi Sunak, from the US President Joe Biden and so on. But I think there will be perhaps some relief that he didn't win a bigger majority, that he's had his wings clipped somewhat. But I think also that there is a realism here in that in the UK, in the EU and other NATO countries, there's a lot of frustration at India's ambivalence towards Russia. India has not imposed the sorts of sanctions on Russia, which many of these countries and, of course, the US have imposed since the invasion of Ukraine. And I think that there is a recognition that, frankly, that's not going to change. Modi is going to govern in the interests of India and nobody else. And at the moment, he still feels that it's in his economic and strategic interests to keep open those channels to Russia, however much the UK, most of Europe and the US might not be that happy about it.
Well, let's look now at the ceremonies still ongoing on the beaches of Normandy, where 80 years ago today, the largest seaborne invasion in military history began the end of Nazi Germany. Every significant anniversary of D-Day has been observed with great ballyhoo, and properly so. It was an enterprise of astonishing ambition and courage from command level to point of contact, and by no means a guaranteed success. This anniversary, however, seems more melancholy than most for two reasons. One, that it is likely the last major commemoration at which any living veterans of D-Day will be present. 5 years ago, 225 British veterans travelled to Normandy, this year 23. And two, that Europe and the United States are once again at war, if at one remove. Carole, have these commemorations felt different to you? Obviously, one difference is that this year we have had the President of Ukraine in attendance and nobody from Russia.
Yeah, indeed, Russia was excluded because of the invasion of Ukraine. I've been struck, well, certainly, first of all, just by the extraordinary and emotional stories of what those troops went through. And, of course, all the veterans that are surviving were incredibly young. I was hearing the story of one veteran who's now 98, was 18, when he was second in command of his ship, landing troops on those Normandy beaches and watching some of those that had gone ahead already being struck down. And the calmness, the bravery, the sense of purpose that you hear from those veterans is just, frankly, awe-inspiring. But I think that it has also reminded nations, certainly the UK, but I think across Europe as well, of the fragility of the peace. And, we've talked a lot about the changing security threats and how things have changed so much since the days of the Nazi invasion of Europe. But when we look at what is happening, along those front lines in eastern Ukraine, you've got tanks lined up, troops dug in.
Indeed so.
And there are just some almost terrifying reminders of how close we really are to those sorts of battles. OK, there are now also remotely controlled drones that are doing a lot of damage. There are some high-powered weapons being deployed as well. But after an era during which people were saying, well, we're never going to need squadrons of tanks ever again, I think many NATO countries have been forced to rethink that approach since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I think that has just been brought home so poignantly by what we've been seeing in D-Day, and a reminder that you always need to be prepared for the unexpected.
Somnath, as one of two representatives of the Commonwealth at this table, me being the other one, I will put this to you. Perhaps not so much the D-Day commemorations, but commemorations of World War II anniversaries generally, and there's going to be a lot of them this year and next year for obvious reasons. Do they rankle at all in India, which of course made an enormous contribution to the Allied victory in World War II? I looked this up earlier, 2.3 million soldiers, 89,000 of them died, 31 Victoria Crosses, and there is of course the subsidiary knock-on effects such as the 3 million deaths in the Bengali famine of 1943. I think, or at least I like to think, that the organisations which oversee commemorations have got better in recent years at recalling that this was not a war in Europe exclusively won by white people. But does India still feel perhaps a bit left out of this?
India, the Caribbean, countries in East Africa, yes, the Indian subcontinent, I must say, Pakistan and Bangladesh today.
Well, yeah, those 2.3 million soldiers would have been drawn from what is now Pakistan and Bangladesh. About
70 to 80,000 of them Muslims. So when our national rhetoric here, the anti-Muslim rhetoric that we hear, when we should be mindful. It also reminds me that the isolationist practices that Western countries lead now, we must understand that moments like the D-Day and the war which was won with a lot of help from various countries. It's a reminder of what collaborations, coalitions can do and what being a small island might mean. So while, yes, this is a long story and I can go on about the books and the scholarship, and I don't want, and on a day such as this, you don't want to bring it up too much. But I liked what King Charles said, that, it's the 160,000 British Commonwealth and Allied troops. There's a clear, direct mention and acknowledgement. And this has happened in the last 10 years, as you say. And again, you hope that commentators here, politicians here, when they speak of this, it just reminds us that what grand alliances, even the EU elections, which we'll talk about next, is that grand alliances can make major contributions for good. And living alone, being anti-globalization, anti-migrants, anti-refugees, leads to greater problems.
Well, on the subject of those elections, we did start today's show with the world's biggest election, and we'll look now at the world's second biggest, possibly, depending on turnout. Starting today, 373 million citizens of the European Union are eligible to vote for a new European Parliament. If recent EU elections are any guide, it is unlikely that more than half will bother. It is, of course, also the first European Parliament election to be held without the input of that eccentric minority of UK citizens who ever used to bother to vote in them themselves. Carole, speaking as a representative of the no longer voting in EU elections British people, do you feel especially left out?
Do you know, I think what is interesting is the way that the British public have completely switched off from these European elections, just thinking, right, well, thank goodness we haven't got to try and get our oar in with that lot. But I think they're making a big mistake. I mean, it's our nearest neighbour. We do need to trade to deal with our European neighbours. And the results of these elections is going to have some pretty far-reaching consequences. The big theme, which is raising a lot of concern in governments across Europe, is the rise of far-right populist nationalist parties. The voting began in the Netherlands, where Geert Wilders has already been out and about warning some of those leaders of Europe who thought that they basically run the European continent, that, look, you better watch out and see what's coming. And although it looks unlikely that the nationalist and populist, the far-right parties will actually have an overall majority in that parliament, they will be a pretty powerful bloc or blocks. We may have more than one. And of course, the parliament then chooses the makeup of the commission, which has the real power. So I think that it's going to be fascinating to see what this shows us about the mood of voters across the European Union, where many, many voters feel that they're more long-standing, more centrist political leaders have not properly responded to the pandemic, to the war in Ukraine, in terms of what it means for them and their lives, the rising costs of living and the difficulties in their economies in many of these countries, and the fact that we are seeing these nationalist, populist leaders who appear to be capturing the public imagination. And I think the consequences of that are not quite clear yet, but we're already seeing it, for example, in the Netherlands, where you've got Geert Wilders pretty much in control of the government. You've got the AFD in Germany also on the rise. Giorgia Meloni, a more moderate but still a right-wing leader in power in Italy. What she does will be fascinating. But I think it is those groupings on the right that everyone's got their eye on at the moment.
Somnath, is part of the problem, Carole mentions the populists capturing the imagination, is part of the problem there that the EU Parliament as an institution and EU elections as an idea still have not captured the imagination. Turnout last time was only just over 50%, and that was actually quite a big increase on 2014. And in newer members especially, turnout is abysmal. In Latvia, Bulgaria, Croatia, Slovenia, Czech Republic and Slovakia last time, under a third of people bothered to vote.
I mean, the nation state looms so large over our imagination that we rarely as voters think beyond the nation state. And so I can understand that. But the importance of the European Commission lies because of environmental standards, human rights, the biggest trading bloc. I mean, it's a massively important bloc. I mean, without UNHCR, I can imagine the Rwanda flights would have taken off. You know, the importance of this bloc, as Carole was just saying, and why the UK public should take much more heed of this, and why if right-wing small populist groups get on too much power, why things might look very ugly. So yes, I hope the 27 nations take this seriously, because much of, there are two things which I think European Commission will, whatever they do in the next 5 years, 4 years, will be important, is environmental standards and what happens with human rights, especially in Europe because of the refugee crisis, the migrant issue. This will become very important.
Just a final thought on this one, Carole. Is there still a problem as well that the rest of the world, never mind the actual citizens of the EU, but the rest of the world doesn't really see the EU as a thing? I mean, there's that quote, possibly apocryphal, attributed to Henry Kissinger, that if I want to speak to Europe, who do I call? But is it necessarily a bad thing if the EU never becomes, for example, anywhere near as cohesive as the United States House of Representatives? Well,
I think it's inevitable that when you see a European Union that has expanded, that's got 27 members, it's not going to be as cohesive as when there were 11 or 12. And I think what is interesting is that with that expansion, which most EU leaders have supported, with one or two exceptions, it has meant that the traditional European powers of France and Germany just can't control the EU in the way that they used to. I mean, it's interesting. I see the Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, is saying the very soul of Europe is at risk. And he noted that only 4 out of 27 EU member states now have centre-left or left-wing parties in government. And I think that shows you about how that mood has changed. Now, inevitably, there is a tension, and that, of course, is what led in the end to Britain leaving the European Union, by what power you have as an individual state and whether you have a stronger voice as part of a much bigger bloc. But I think what will be interesting is that, those right-wing parties are stressing nationalism, cracking down on migration, taking powers back from the European Union. And I think that could lead to a further weakening of the bloc at a time where some of those more traditional power bases in France, in Germany, in Spain and so on, are really struggling to try to actually identify what the EU stands for.
Well, to Finland now, where during the 7 annual minutes in which going to the beach does not seem like an act of insanity, the police in the settlement of Espoo have undertaken their annual ritual of firing up the loudspeakers with this. They are broadcasting a selection of Strauss, Handel, Schubert and Vivaldi across the sands of Hokelahti. They do this in order to deter the young folk who it is feared might otherwise congregate and commit scarcely imaginable depravity. Somnath, this is not necessarily unique to Finland. There are plenty of other places in the world, railway stations to name but one, who do broadcast classical music with the express intention of scaring away young people. Why does it work?
What I'm reminded of, the Calcutta Metro, and I was a journalist there, and there were loads of suicides. So the government put out Tagore songs, Rabindranath Tagore songs, to calm people down and not jump off into the railway tracks.
Did it work?
I don't know. I don't know if the figures went up or not, but I remember doing a story. But yes, music in public places and in traffic congestions in Calcutta, I know that they play loudspeakers. I mean, I don't know if they work now. I mean, I'm just thinking they're terribly irritating.
How is broadcasting classical music going to make anybody's car move any faster?
The pedestrians don't rush in and
so
cross.
The pedestrians don't rush in.
Yes, it's all for us.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the idea is that it has a deterrent effect, Carole, on teenagers, but possibly a calming one on people past a certain age. I have my doubts about this.
Or jumping off tracks. Just calm down. You don't have to do this.
I have my doubts about this entire premise.
Look, I think this is a wonderful idea. I know that we've seen in popular beaches in the UK, in other parts of Europe, there are concerns that particularly post-exams you get large numbers of very excitable teenagers down on the beaches and all your posh, local, middle-aged, middle-class residents and second homeowners are absolutely horrified and shocked at it. And in Cornwall in the southwest of England, particularly just after the pandemic, when you did get large numbers of teenagers down there because they couldn't go to the nightclubs, they actually started introducing curfews and banning booze and so on. Look, I think if you could have a slightly more civilised approach, say, look, let's put out some nice calming music, just calm everyone down a bit, and just recognise that, look, young people want to get out on the beach and have a few drinks and, get to know other young people who are at a similar stage in their lives, just embarking on adulthood. They've all had an incredibly stressful time during the pandemic. If they can be allowed to go out there, enjoy themselves, but perhaps do so in a slightly more sedate way, calmed by that music, which I thoroughly enjoyed, I think it's absolutely brilliant.
I mean, I can understand, Somnath, that music can have a deterrent effect on the grounds that I am personally deterred several times a week from spending any time in bars, restaurants and shops in London by the fact
that's a great
that
deterrent.
by the fact that they are playing music. I'm pretty sure they don't actually want to deter people who are attempting to spend money, but that's entirely up to them. I'm just wondering if you have any ideas or any thoughts that you would like to broadcast to the world about measures for improving, calming the behaviour of people. I mean, regular listeners would be well aware that I favour, correctly equipped and empowered squads roaming the London Underground network armed with tasers.
Do you?
Yeah,
Good Lord. No, I have
to deal with people who are broadcasting audio out loud on their phones.
Oh yes, no, that I mean, I wouldn't go as far as you.
See, that's why nothing will ever get fixed, Somnath. But what do you think would actually work if not actually tasering people?
Churchill's speeches would be a good deterrent. I mean, you know.
See, the thing is, I can understand possibly where you come from and where I come from. Churchill's speeches where you come from and I come from are not going to calm people down. It's going to have precisely the opposite effect.
The one thing I would introduce is an absolute ban on any Christmas music until December the 23rd. I think that would calm people wonderfully.
Yeah.
I personally find my blood pressure rising as soon as I hear one of those awful Christmas songs in the middle of the autumn.
I agree absolutely. December 23rd to, let's say, December 28th. I'm a reason. Knock yourselves out. But other than that, no. While we have finally two journalists at the table, I did want to put to you both a question of journalistic technique, because the most amazing part of this story, and I'd be interested in your views on how they might have done this. This is reported by YLE, Finland's national broadcaster. They got a quote from Espoo resident, it says here, Irja Akason. I find it a bit strange. 6 syllables from a Finn. How did they do it? I'm astonished.
I have to confess that I've never tried doing vox pops in Finland, so I don't feel I've got really quite the right experience to answer this. But look, what I would just say is that this is I would have loved to have seen the vox pops and to have heard a few wider views on this.
There are no wider views. This is the longest coat you could get.
Yeah,
exactly.
Exactly.
I mean,
and in print, it's fine, isn't it? Because you can just
Yes.
take a little bit. Doing vox pops in London is a nightmare. Doing them anywhere in the United States is an absolute dream. Everyone talks in sound bites the whole time.
I know. I once spent, I had to spend 10 days at sea with a bunch of Finns in order to get enough quotes to pad out a 1,500-word story. Any other?
Did you manage?
I did. It was a near-run thing, but any other nationality would have taken me an afternoon. Somnath Batabyal and Carole Walker, thank you both for joining us. And finally on today's show, by about this time 80 years ago, most of the initial D-Day landing force of roughly 130,000 troops were ashore on Normandy's beaches and fighting their way inland at considerable cost. More than 10,000 would be killed or injured on the first day of the Allied invasion of France. D-Day has been much and deservedly memorialised and mythologised, and on this 80th anniversary, a new BBC series, D-Day, The Unheard Tapes, brings fresh life to the memories of those who took part, using interviews with D-Day veterans recorded decades ago, lip-synced by modern actors. I spoke earlier to the series director Mark Radici here at Midori House. I began by asking how daunting it is to find a new way to tell such a frequently told story.
Tremendously difficult, because certainly, it's anniversaries. There's a problem with anniversaries. There's D-Day anniversaries every 5 years. I actually worked on a D-Day film, in 2001. So I'd already been to Normandy a long time ago and looked into things. And what was that angle? That was about the incredible science and machines that went into it. So think about this one. It wasn't just a different editorial angle or a new story. It was a way of bringing it to a younger audience, which is also often a challenge. They're always trying to bring a new generation in to learn a story that we know already.
Well, for the benefit of listeners who haven't yet seen it and who hopefully will start watching it at the conclusion of this broadcast, what was different about this telling of D-Day? What was the technique you eventually lit on?
Okay, so this series is called D-Day, The Unheard Voices, and what we wanted to do was work with oral testimony of people's accounts of what it was like to experience D-Day. Because actually, what are we now, 2024? if there are some veterans still alive, but the youngest they are is late 90s. Most of them are in their hundreds. And we wanted to hear people's... Obviously, you're not going to find a 50-year-old, 60-year-old, 40-year-old speaking about that anymore. That's impossible. You can't go back in time. But there are these tape recordings, either recorded for books or by journalists or for archives. And there's an incredible resource that we then stumbled across, and we worked with archives around the world, really. So approached the Imperial War Museum in London, the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, some personal private collections, recordings. And so the big thing we then did was then cast actors who resembled these men to lip sync. So it was looking as if they were being interviewed, recounting their experience of fighting and experiencing D-Day and the Battle of Normandy.
Well, on the night of the 5th, we went. It's an amazing, amazing sight. Everywhere you looked, there were ships of all shapes and sizes. The sky always seemed to be full of our planes with the black and white stripes on them. And everything seemed to stand out in Technicolor. It seemed to be a psychedelic picture.
Leaving aside the difficulties which you've adumbrated of speaking to living veterans who are very few in number and extremely old, what do you think was the extra power of having these words, lip synced by people who look like they might be roughly the same age as the people who originally intoned those recollections?
Well, I think the real power is the approach we took. So it's not simply actors speaking words. So once we'd found the audio, found these accounts, we then spent... Because actually these aren't just soldiers speaking, these are beloved family members. These are someone's grandfather, someone's father. So we then spent a long time contacting the families and working with the families. So first of all, to tell them what was happening and respectful conversations about it, but then asking what these men were like as people and personalities, finding it... So it's not simply that the actors resemble them, but the actors have learnt about who they were. So this could be their mannerisms. One of the characters, James Kelly, who is a Royal Marine Commando from Liverpool, I remember his family saying they talked about the James Kelly finger, that he would, when he was making a point, he would stick his finger up. And it's a small thing. You don't want to do that too much. You don't want the actor, every time he speaks, to be sticking his finger up, but just once. And it's just... And and I've seen the actors recently. I saw some of them last night, and I thought this was really magical because obviously they're actors, they're on Instagram, they can be found, and several of them have been located and contacted by family members of the men whose voices are in the series, so grandchildren they think it's amazing. They've contacted the actors to say they've captured their grandfather. They remind him of him.
That does suggest you've done something right. But in those conversations with families, when you were trying to flesh out these characters, was there any... And I know you're talking about a potential cast of literally thousands, and every story and every individual who went ashore at Normandy is different. But was there anything in common? Did they talk of the men being, stereotypically reluctant to talk about what D-Day had been like to their friends and family?
Yes, but not 100%, because obviously we have got their testimony, because that's very common, actually. I spoke to a friend the other day who said that her grandfather, who'd written detailed diaries about World War II, every single part of it, but then when it came to D-Day, it was just blank, never spoke about it. This was different. These were the few that had spoken about it, but I thought it was really fascinating, insightful about how people speak about it. I'm really interested in how do people remember things, and... Some, like James Kelly, who I've just mentioned, he would quite often almost laugh at moments of quite tragic situations. Or Warwick, who another Royal Marine Commando, very terse, chose his words very carefully. I think because there's something here. How do men, and actually young men, very young men, a lot of them were sort of 20, 21, some of them are teenagers, they go through this extraordinary, harrowing experience. How do they remember it? They're not going to break down and cry about it. They find different ways of coping, and that really comes across in the voices. And I spoke about this a lot with the actors, because actually the way someone tells the story tells you how they are feeling. You know, it's just really interesting. Very different to, I don't know, a historian or a presenter describing what it was like on D-Day.
Just a final question on how you, I guess, winnowed the material down into what ends up getting broadcast, because obviously, and I think it's one of the challenges, I guess, to anybody who tells any story about the Second World War, that the first-hand recollections of any combat soldier who fought anywhere in that conflict are going to seem more or less incredible to people alive now, or to most people alive now. I guess we are getting an added poignancy to these celebrations given what is happening in Ukraine, but you can't cram all of that into a few hours of television. So how did you decide which parts of the story to tell?
I think that's really interesting, because also these are individuals. So although war is a collective effort, their experience is very personal and individual. A, because they are an individual, and B, they don't know what's going on. They're landing on one beach. They don't know what's happening on the other beaches. They don't know what is going to happen, whether it's going to be successful or not. But often we were quite led by some of the more quirky, unsurprising memories. Sort of, they almost challenge your assumptions of D-Day. So James Kelly, when he was describing the crossing, the great crossing of the English Channel, this huge armada, the largest seaborne force in history. His memory was of the self-heating soup that they had on the boat. Or we have, again, challenging assumptions. We have interviews with German veteran or soldiers and French civilians. That was very important to see it from other sides. So we have one Austrian-German commander of the Merville battery who talks about how his father had been sent to Dachau for speaking against Hitler, calling him a criminal. So it's just challenging assumptions, looking for things that, because you can still tell the story of D-Day with the archive, and there can be a central narrative spine. There's obviously a chronology to events, the 5th of June, the night, the 6th of June, the landings, Omaha, followed by the British beaches and things. But it's those personal experiences, that personal truth in between the main narrative that really brings it alive.
On the way in, it was rough. As we got near the shore, while going in, we seen the rocket ships firing away the rockets. You couldn't see much because we were supposed to keep our heads down and couldn't hear anything. Diesel motors on the boats always remind me of a bus back home.
That was Mark Radici, series director of D-Day, The Unheard Tapes, which can be found on BBC iPlayer. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to my panellists today, Carole Walker and Somnath Batabyal. The show was produced by Chris Chermak and researched by Gunnar Grunlid. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.